So, for a long time since the discovery of DNA, we understood, or at least scientists understood, what they meant when they said something was genetic. It meant predetermined, it meant nature and not nurture. But consider this. In 2015, doctors discovered a tumor in Monica Hoffman. Her breast cancer had already reached to stage 2, progressed to stage 2. And her sister, Erica Hoffman, was always by her side, taking care of her through the chemotherapies and the remissions. But why is this interesting? Why am I telling you this? Erica Hoffman, turns out, was not just some sister of Monica's, but she was Monica's monozygotic twin, an identical twin. Now that's surprising. Identical twins are supposed to have an identical genetic code. That means that the genes are supposed to match 100% with one another. And cancer, or at least breast cancer as we know it, was supposed to be genetic. So what's happening? Did laws of nature suddenly suspend themselves for Monica? Was this some sort of divine punishment? Did we completely misunderstand how genes work? And I'm here to tell you that, fortunately or unfortunately, that does not seem to be the case. Monica and Erica might not have known it then, but they fed a much needed fuel to the fire, which is epigenetics. I know that was quite a bit. That was a long introduction for epigenetics, but I'd say it was a much needed one. Epigenetics is increasingly getting more relevant. In fact, I'd say it's never been more important to consider it than it is right now, because it promises quite a lot. Fixing Alzheimer's, figuring out the persistence of homosexuality and gender dysphoria, explaining the origin of anatomical differences between man and woman, and many other things, including cancer, of course. And ultimately, what it's trying to do is trying to understand why the zygote, which is the first cell formed after fertilization, multiplies first to form an embryo. But for some reason, some of the cells decide to become liver cells or brain cells or sperm cells, and assuming they don't have their own sentience, how does this work? So what is epigenetics? I'm glad you asked. Is the regulation of gene expression with the transcription of DNA to RNA or the translation of RNA proteins is mediated by some epigenetic marker groups, essentially to either suppress or express a genetic sequence? Or, simply put, is the process in which some chemicals on or near the genes turns them on or off. And the combinations of the genes that are turned on and off in a particular cell determines its morphology and the function of the cell. And this is called the gene expression profile of the cell. And if you have the gene expression profile of a cell, you can accurately predict what kind of cell it is. So epigenetics actually works. So let me try to explain how this works. Typically, DNA is converted to RNA by RNA polymerase, and this RNA helps make proteins for the cells, and proteins basically make up everything else. So imagine DNA to be the double-stranded DNA to be a ladder, and the rails of this ladder make up the two strands of DNA, and the steps make up the bases, A, T, G, and C, which are the letter codes used by DNA. Now, imagine RNA polymerase to be a man, let's say an old man, a grandpa with his grandpa glasses and a grandpa notebook. And his job is to climb the steps one by one and make note of the letters in the steps in his own language, which is slightly different from the ladder's language. Poor grandpa can't write the letter T for some reason and writes U instead. But DNA is not just a ladder, is it? It's a helical ladder, so it's actually coiled. So more work for Grandpa to navigate through this coiled structure. But that's all right. Grandpa is used to the exploitation that comes with capitalist societies, so he will do his job. But sometimes it just doesn't stop there. Sometimes the DNA is supercoiled. What that means is DNA, which is a helix, an already coiled structure, is coiled yet again. And now this is actually too much work for Grandpa, and he leaves. He has to. And this is how gene expression is controlled in some cases. The DNA is so coiled that RNA polymerase no longer can access it, physically unable to access it. But other times, expression is controlled in different ways. Sometimes Grandpa's moving up the ladder and he finds a note attached to one of the steps, usually a cytosine step, which is a note from his husband or wife asking him to come home immediately, and he has to leave, and the transcription is stopped again. So this node is typically a methyl group, a carbon atom with 3 hydrogen atoms on the cytosine. And the recognition of methyl groups on a cytosine, so recognition of methyl cytosine by the RNA polymerase, stops the transcription. And turns out that this methyl group was actually the reason, this methyl group actually was the structural thing that determined that Monica and not Erica was the one getting cancer. So epigenetics is the next big thing in biology. The proper unraveling of epigenetics will reveal more than DNA has. It's an intermediary step to understanding consciousness, yet another question that humans have asked, which we consider one of the big questions. And finally, it's also an answer to the blurry line between nature and nurture. So thank you for listening.